Atma Namaste. Let's begin with a short invocation. Please close your eyes. Inhale and exhale slowly and deeply. Relax your body. Be aware of your whole body. Mentally say, I am not the body. The body is just a vehicle of the soul. I am the soul. I am that I am. Visualize your whole body disintegrate and disappear. Inhale slowly and deeply, and exhale slowly and deeply. Be aware of your thoughts and your emotions. Just observe each and every thought that comes to your mind and fades away. Mentally say, I am not my thoughts. I am not my emotions. Thoughts and emotions are just products of the soul. I am the soul. I am that I am. Visualize all your thoughts and emotions disintegrate and disappear. What remains is just brilliant white light. Inhale slowly and deeply. Exhale slowly and deeply. Be aware of your crown. Mentally say to the Supreme Being, Divine Father, Divine Mother, to Grandmaster Shuak Sui, Lord Mahaguruji Mailing, and all the great ones, all the holy gurus, holy masters, saints, archangels, holy angels, and spiritual helpers. Thank you for all of your priceless blessings, for divine light, divine love, and divine power, divine guidance, help, and protection. Thank you for illuminating our minds. To all the masters of Theosophy, thank you so much for your guidance, help, and protection. Thank you in full faith. Inhale slowly, inhale all the blessings. Exhale slowly and be aware of your whole body. Inhale slowly, exhale slowly. Inhale slowly, inhale all the blessings. And when you are comfortable, gently open your eyes with a big smile. Atma Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the 5th session. So let's begin. So we start now to understand about the ego and reincarnation, what happens in every reincarnation and what is the effect on the ego. And then we will continue with the next chapters. So the method of achieving this result is, as we know, that of reincarnation. This result means reincarnation. The ego putting forth part of himself into the lower planes for the sake of the experience to be gained there, and then withdrawing back again into himself, bearing with him the results of his endeavor. So basically, it's like investing the energy and then expecting profits in return. So it must not be thought, however, that the ego makes any movement in space. It is rather that he endeavors to focus his consciousness at a lower level to obtain an expression through a denser variety of matter. So when we say the ego put forth part of himself into the lower planes, it doesn't mean movement in space. It just means focusing the consciousness into a lower level, okay, and then gaining experience through it. This putting forth of part of himself into incarnation has often been compared with an investment. The ego expects, if all goes well, to reclaim not only the whole of his capital invested, but also a considerable amount of interest, and he usually obtains this. But as with other investments, there is occasionally loss instead of gain, for it is possible that some portion of that which he puts down may become so entangled with the lower matter that it may be impossible wholly to reclaim it. So usually, like in business, when a person invests, let's say a portion of his or her money, So they expect to receive the money back plus some interest. Okay, so they expect the money to be, let's say, double, triple, or more. So this is the same thing that happens with the ego. So when he invests the energy in as the incarnated soul, they expect to receive it back plus lessons and uh, more evolution. So we call it the interest. But sometimes, and most of the time this happens, but sometimes they may lose some portion of the matter because the matter gets so much entangled um, with matter, not the portion of the energy, because it gets so much entangled with matter, so they cannot actually take the whole thing back. So sometimes it's just even or even loss. So the student will by now have fully realized that each stage of the descent of the ego into incarnation means submission to limitation. Consequently, no expression of the ego upon any of the lower planes can ever be a perfect expression. So when the ego descends and incarnates, it means being bound by the limitation of the physical plane, the astral plane, the lower mental plane. Okay, so the expression of the ego will not be perfect in the lower planes. It is merely an indication of its qualities, just as a picture is a representation on a two-dimensional surface of a three-dimensional scene. In exactly the same way, the true quality as it exists in the ego cannot be expressed in the matter of any lower level. The vibrations of the lower matter are altogether too dull and sluggish to represent it. The string is not sufficiently taut to enable it to respond to the note which resounds from above. It can, however, be tuned to correspond with it in a lower octave, like a man's voice singing in unison with a boy's, expressing the same sound as nearly as the capability of the inferior organism permits. Okay, so imagine a painter is drawing a certain scene on a piece of paper. It can never represent the exact scene because or object, because the object is in three-dimensional reality, is a three-dimensional reality, but what is drawn, the picture, is just in two dimensions. So same happens with the ego. So what we experience in this world is not really the ego because of the limitations. It is not possible in physical language to express exactly this matter of the descent of the ego, but until we are able to raise our own consciousness to those levels and see exactly what takes place, the best impression we can have of it is perhaps the idea of the ego putting down part of himself like a tongue of fire into planes of matter grosser than his own. The ego belonging as he does to a higher plane is a much greater and grander thing than any manifestation of him can be. His relation to his personalities is that of one dimension to another, that of a square to a line, or a cube to a square. No number of squares could ever make a cube, because the square has only two dimensions, while the cube has three. So no number of expressions on any lower plane can ever exhaust the fullness of the ego. Even if he could take 1,000 personalities, he could still not sufficiently express all that he is. So imagine we have a cube and then have a section of the cube. Okay, so um, let's say, let me draw. Let's say we have this cube here, and then we have a surface and cut this cube with this surface. Okay, so what we get is just a square. Now, no matter how many surfaces or how many squares we get from this cube, we can never experience the exact quality of the cube, because cube has three dimensions and the square has two dimensions. So similarly, it says, even if the ego takes 1,000 personalities, still cannot sufficiently express. Yes, in previous previous study sessions on the solar system, I think we discussed about a fourth dimension, and then we explained about it. So it's very difficult to understand it because here we are experiencing three dimensions. So similarly, the ego cannot express itself through personalities because it's different dimensions basically. The most for which we can hope is that the personality will contain nothing which is not intended by the ego, that the personality will express as much of the ego as can be expressed in his lower world. The wise man thus recognizes that the true man is the ego, not the personality or the physical body, and he sees that it is the life of the ego only which is really of moments, and that everything connected with the body must unhesitatingly be subordinated to those higher interests. He recognizes that this earth life is given to him for purposes of progression, and that progress is the one important thing. The real purpose of life is the unfoldment of his powers as an ego, the development of his character. He recognizes that this development is in his own hands, and that the sooner it is perfected, the happier and more useful will he be. So means what we can do is understand that the true human, or that the true man doesn't mean male figure, it just means the true person is the ego, not the personality. Okay, so whatever happened to us in this life doesn't matter. Only what we bring later back to the ego or the higher soul is important. So sometimes we go through challenges, and even sometimes accidents happen and a portion of the body may get paralyzed or amputated or whatever. Doesn't matter, because all of this is happening to the bodies, to the physical body. Mm, Things may happen to the astral body, mental body, but what is important is the ego. So the essence of the experience that we take to the ego, the lessons that we learn, and our character that we are developing, that is the most important thing. We may lose our job, we may lose our possessions, all of this is not important. At the end of the day, what lessons we learn and the qualities that we are developing is important. Furthermore, he soon learns by experience that nothing can be really good for him as an ego or for anyone which is not good for all. In due time, he thus learns to forget himself altogether and to ask only what will be best for humanity as a whole. So we will discuss about this in later chapters, about the consciousness of the ego. So later on, as we are developing, we will understand that if something is good for all, is good for us. So if something is not good for all, is not good for us also. So whatever is good for the humanity as a whole is good for us as well. The whole object of the ego putting himself down is that he may become more definite, that all his vaguely beautiful feelings may crystallize into a definite resolution to act. All his incarnations form a process by means of which he may gain precision and definiteness, hence specialization in his way of advancement. He comes down into each race or sub-race in order that he may acquire the qualities for the perfection of what that sub-race is working. The fragment of the ego which is put down is highly specialized. When a certain quality is developed, the ego absorbs it into himself in due course, and he does that over and over again. The personality scatters something of its special achievement over the whole when it is withdrawn into the ego, so that the ego becomes a little less vague than before. So you remember in previous sessions we discussed about the evolution of the ego, okay, that initially is vague and colorless, and gradually it becomes with color and more definite, and also grow in size. So basically, the ego, together with the help of higher beings and the guru, will decide what is needed to be learned and what the ego needs basically, okay, for the course of his evolution, and then decides where the personality needs to incarnate, which race, which sub-race, which country, and then by incarnating in that country, in that race and that sub-race, develop certain qualities. Okay, so I suggest maybe after this session or within the week, you do some inner reflection and think, why are you born in the country that you are born? Like why you are born in Malaysia, why you are born in India, why you are born in Middle East, in US, in Canada, whichever country it is, in Europe. What are the qualities you have gone so far, you have got so far from that country, okay? And what you are learning, why you are born in a certain family, what qualities have you learned? Sometimes you may notice that there are certain differences. For example, you may be interested so much into spirituality, but your family is totally materialistic. So instead of thinking, I don't fit here, I'm not sure why I'm here, and this is not the family for me, think, why am I here? Maybe you have already learned how to be a very good spiritual person, and maybe you have learned how to just sit and meditate, for example. Now you need to gain new qualities. For example, you also need to learn how to do business. You also need to learn how to be more industrious, or be active, or be dynamic, or be good in finance and whatsoever. So in whatever situation we are put, there is a reason for it. We, we should not think, I don't fit, okay, um, this is not for me. We should think, why am I here? Sometimes we are put in a certain situation to learn new skills. Sometimes we are put in the presence of a certain spiritual guide or guru to learn from them. Sometimes we are put in another situation to test if we have learned. And if we show that we have learned in some other incarnation, we may be placed in a certain situation to teach. So we need to know ourselves, and no one can tell like exactly why we are somewhere. We can do meditation and inner reflection and know it for ourselves why. Okay, now Malaysia has a lot more things to give besides being multiracial. Okay, like for example, sometimes you may be born in a certain country, let's say India or Middle East or anywhere, and then after living there for a number of years, let's say 10 years, 20 years, you may travel and go and live in another country, let's say 10 years in another country, and then you gain new things. So we need to be aware, we need to be mindful and see what we are learning and what we can learn, because if we are aware, we can learn more. We can learn by just looking at other people's lives. We can learn by joining study sessions like this. We can learn by following our teacher, like by following our Hatha Yoga. Before any problem even happen or challenge happen to us, we are actually trying to learn and improve our character. So we don't need to wait for life to create a certain difficult situation and challenge for us to learn. Before the challenge even happen, we can learn already. And then the challenge will not happen, or maybe happen very mild, because we have already learned, so we know what to do in the in that situation. Okay. So many similes and metaphors have from time to time been employed to illustrate the relation between the ego and his personalities or incarnations. Thus, each incarnation has been compared to a day at school. In the morning of each new life, the ego takes up his lessons again at the point where he left in the night before. The time taken by the pupil in qualifying himself is left entirely to his own discretion and energy. The wise pupil perceives that school life is not an end in itself, but merely a preparation for a more glorious and far wider future. He cooperates intelligently with his teachers and sets himself to the maximum of work which is possible for him, in order that as soon as can he may come of age and enter into the kingdom as a glorified ego. Okay, so Grandmaster Chokoksui also says life is like a training ground. So this book also says our life in each incarnation is like school. Okay, so in school, every year we go through certain lessons, we learn certain lessons, and then we have a test at the end. So similarly in life, we also go through challenges, we learn things, and the challenges are like tests to see if we have actually learned things. Now, in school, each student has free will to learn super fast. There are some students who learn one semester, one school year, um, and even during the summer break, they learn another one. So it's like they jump and go faster than the rest of the students. There are some students who learn medium pace like everybody else. And there are some students who lag behind. So they fail and they have to redo again and again one year, one, let's say, term, so that they can move forward. So it's similar in life. Some people, they learn super fast. They try to be aware. They learn by looking, as we just said, by looking at other people's life, by following the teacher. Grandmaster Chuakoksui says the spiritual world is as complicated as Amazon forest. So follow the footsteps of the teacher not to get hurt. So some people follow simple instructions. They follow the footsteps of a guru and they learn super fast. Some students, medium pace, and some slow. The choice is ours. Grandmaster, I remember him saying, guess who's kinder, the teacher or life? We have a choice. How fast we want to learn and how we want to learn. From a teacher, following the footsteps not to get hurt, or from life. We have to learn anyway, but we have a choice how to learn and how fast. The ego may be regarded as a laborer who goes out into a field, toiling in rain and sunshine, in cold and heat, returning home at night. But the laborer is also the proprietor, and all the results of his labor fill his own granaries and enrich his own store. Each personality is the immediately effective part of the individuality, representing in it the lower world. There is no injustice in the lot that falls to the personality, because the ego sowed the karma in the past and the ego must reap it. The laborer that sowed the seed must harvest it, though the cloth in which he worked as sower may have worn out during the interval between the sowing and the reaping. He who reaps is the same as he who sows. And if he sowed but little seed, or seed badly chosen, it is he who will find but a poor harvest when as reaper he goes again into the field. Okay, so we are like a farmer, and every time, every incarnation, we plant new seeds and then we have to harvest. So basically, we should not look at the personality, we should look at the ego. The ego is the one who sowed as the personality, and the ego will be the one who will harvest. Okay, and the personality is like the dress that the ego wears, okay, in every work day. Okay, sometimes wear jeans, sometimes wear casual clothes, sometimes pajamas, doesn't matter. But the clothes will change. So it means the personalities will change, but the ego is the same. So whatever seeds the ego is planted, the ego will harvest also. Sometimes, I think Grandmaster says things happen because of a cause, but sometimes we just do not know the cause. Okay, so whatever is happening to us is because of a reason. But sometimes we just don't know the reason, because sometimes we just don't know what we have done in the past. Regarding the ego as the real man and looking at him on his own plane, we see him to be indeed a glorious being. The only way in which down here we can form a conception of what he really is to think of him as some splendid angel. But the expression of this beautiful being on the physical plane may fall far short of all this. In fact, it must do so, first because it is only a tiny fragment, secondly because it is so cramped by its conditions. Okay, so we may say ego is like a glorious angel, but we cannot understand the reality of it because number one, um, the personality is just a tiny fragment of the ego, and number two, it's limited by the conditions of the physical plane, astral plane, lower mental plane. If a man puts his finger into a hole in the wall or into a small metal pipe so that he cannot even bend the finger, it is obvious that he could express but very little of himself through that finger. Much like that is the fate of that fragment of the ego which is put down into this dense body. So, what we are experiencing now is like the finger which is put inside a hole in the wall and cannot be even bent. So, that is the comparison between the ego and the personality. We may carry the analogy a little further by supposing that the finger has a considerable amount of consciousness of its own, so that, shut off as it is from the rest of the body, it temporarily forgets that it is merely a part of the whole body. Forgetting the freedom of the wider life, it tries to adapt itself to the whole. It glides its sides and makes it an enjoyable whole by acquiring money, property, fame, and so forth, not realizing that it only begins really to live when it withdraws itself from the whole altogether and recognizes itself as a part of the body. Clumsy as is the image, it may yet give some sort of idea of the relation of the personality and the ego. So imagine the ego is like the body who puts a finger inside the hole. Now imagine if the finger has some consciousness also. Now the fingers forget about the body and think about the hole and try to make itself comfortable in the hole. But that finger should realize that living life fully means to forget about the whole and think about the body. Other and more picturesque analogies are to be found in certain ancient myths. So there are so many stories about this in different cultures and mythological stories. Thus, Narcissus was a youth of great beauty who fell in love with his own image reflected in the water and was so attracted by it that he fell in and was drowned and was afterwards changed by the gods into a flower and bound to earth. This, of course, refers to the ego looking down upon the waters of the astral plane and the lower world, reflecting itself in the personality, identifying itself with that personality, falling in love with its image, and being bound to earth. It's just a mythological story referring to ego looking down at himself. As was mentioned in chapter 13, the whole course of the movement down into matter is called in India the Pravriti Marga, literally the path of pursuit of forthgoing. The Nivriti Marga is the path of return, of retirement, of renunciation. These terms are relative and can be applied to the whole course of the evolution of the ego to an individual incarnation in a personality. On the Pravriti Marga, on which are the vast majority of men, desires are necessary and useful, these being the motives that prompt him to activity. On the Nivriti Marga, desire must cease. What was desire in the Pravriti Marga becomes will on the Nivriti Marga. Similarly, thought, alert, flighty, changing becomes reason. Work, activity, restless action becomes in its turn sacrifice, its binding force thus being broken. Okay, question. The whole analogy is basically encouraging us to not be bound by our personality. Did I understand it right? And the whole analogy means we should think about the higher soul, not the incarnated soul. So whatever in this life which is of the personality or the incarnated soul doesn't matter. It doesn't last. Okay, like for example, many people work so hard to earn lots of money, but after we die, we are not taking the money with ourselves, but we take the experience. Okay, so in the experience of getting a lot of money, if we hurt other people, if we cheat, if we um, take advantage of other people, those are the things that remains, and it doesn't help the ego because we have not learned anything. We actually created negative karma also. Okay, so what is important? For example, sometimes when you ask people to join spiritual classes and retreats, all of these are for the ego because we meditate together, we learn together, and like we do volunteer work in our healing camps, for example, we do healing for people for free just to make them understand that we are not only this physical body and there is also an energy around it, and then to help them raise their consciousness using the knowledge of energy. All of this is for the benefit of humanity, therefore for the benefit of the ego. Okay, now some people, they say it's very expensive to join. So they prefer to get an expensive mobile phone, for example, rather than join a spiritual class. Now, if you think about it, which one is more permanent? Having the latest model of the mobile phone or spending for our spiritual growth? Which one is more permanent? The mobile phone, even after 1 year or 2 years, the value drops down by half or even more. But what we learn from the spiritual class, let's say from basic pranic healing, from our Hatha yoga, is for the benefit of the soul, because the techniques can be used to accelerate the evolution of the soul and also to help the humanity. So this is what it means. It means instead of thinking about the whole, how I can make more money to make my physical body more comfortable in a house and things like that, we need to think about how I can learn more, how I can serve more, how I can help more humanity and help myself. Of course, comfort of the physical body is also important, but it should not overshadow what is more important, what is more permanent and not temporary, something like that. Okay, now chapter 25, the ego and his investment. Now, what happens to the investment of the ego? This investment analogy is not a mere figure of speech, but has a definite and material side to it. When the ego in his causal body takes to himself in addition a mental and an astral body, the operation involves the actual entangling of a portion of the matter of his causal body with matter of those lower astral and mental types. This putting down of a portion of himself is therefore closely analogous to an investment. As in all investments, the ego hopes to get back he puts more than what he puts out. There is a risk, however, a risk of disappointment, a possibility that he may lose something of what he invests. In fact, under very exceptional circumstances, there may even be a total loss, which leaves him not absolutely bankrupt but without available capital. Elaborating on this analogy, we may remind ourselves that the causal body consists of matter of the first, second, and third subplanes of the mental plane. Okay, do you remember we said mental plane has 7 subplanes, and the four lower subplanes are called the mental plane, and the third higher subplanes are called the causal plane. So here it says we need to be reminded that causal body consists of the matter of the first, second, and third subplanes of the mental plane. By far, the greater portion of it belongs to the first subplane, a lesser portion belongs to the second subplane, and still less to the third. For the vast majority of men, there is as yet no activity beyond the lowest of these three types, and even that is usually partial. It is therefore only some of the lowest type of causal matter that can be put down to lower levels, and only a small fraction even of that part can be entangled with mental and astral matter. Hence, only a very small portion of the ego is in the activity with reference to the personality. Okay, let me just show you the image first, then we will go back to it. So imagine this is the whole causal body. Most of it is in the first subplane, less in the second subplane, and even less in the third subplane. Now, with the majority of people, these two are not yet really in activity. So only this is in activity and not full also, a portion of this. So there is only a limited amount that can be used for entanglement or reincarnation. Entanglement with the physical, astral, and mental matter. Okay. So in fact, with people who are unevolved, probably not more than 100th part of the matter of the third subplane is active. See how much 100th part. With occult students, a little of the second subplane matter is generally in activity also. More advanced students have a great deal of that subplane in activity, and in the stage below that of an arhat, about 1/2 of the ego is active. So the ego, being as yet half asleep, has but a very weak and imperfect control of that which he puts down. But as his physical body grows up and his astral and mental bodies also develop, the causal matter entangled with them is awakened by the vigorous vibrations which reach it through them. The fraction of a fraction which is fully entangled gives life and vigor and a sense of individuality to these vehicles, and they in turn react strongly upon it and arouse it to a keen realization of life. So means initially when the ego is half asleep, doesn't have much control also of what he's putting down, and don't have much to put down also anyway. When he puts down a portion of itself in personality, this starts to vibrate and arouse it to a keen realization of life. So this helps the ego to evolve. This keen realization of life is of course exactly what it needs, the very object for which it is put down. And it is the longing for this keen realization which is Trishna, with which we have already dealt with. But just because this small fraction has had these experiences and is therefore so much more awake than the rest of the ego, it may often be so far intensified as to think itself the whole and forgets for a time its relation to the Father in heaven. So you see, the ego has put a portion of itself as the personality entangled with matter, and because this small fraction starts to have these experiences and feel awake, sometimes forgets about the ego and thinks he himself, or by he we don't mean just male figure, yeah, thinks that he himself is the whole and forgets about the Father in heaven, forgets about the ego, forgets about the roots. It may temporarily identify itself with the matter through which it should be working, and may resist the influence of that other portion which has been put down, but not entangle that which forms the link with the greater mass of the ego on his own plane. Okay, so the personality will forget about the ego and think himself is the whole. Now, diagram 26 may serve to make this matter a little more clear. The causal body is here shown as roughly the shape of a chalice in section. That portion of the ego which is awakened on the third causal subplane is itself divided into three parts, which we shall call A, B, and C. A is a very small part of the ego and remains on its own plane. B is a small part of A, is put down but remains unentangled with the matter of the lower planes. It acts as a link between A and C. C, in turn, is a small part of B and is thoroughly entangled with lower matter of the mental and astral bodies. A we may think of as the body of a man, B as his arm stretched out, C as the hand which grasps, or perhaps rather the tips of the fingers which are dipped in matter. Okay, so imagine this part A, B, and C. A is the portion which remains unentangled, like we call it, let's take the example of the body. B is a portion of the A which is like the arm stretched out into matter but still remains unentangled. C is representing the hand which grasps into matter, and this is entangled with matter. Okay, so this will have experiences. This is the link between A and C. We have here a very delicately balanced arrangement, which may be affected in various ways. The intention is that the hand, which is C, should grasp firmly and guide the matter with which it is entangled, being fully directed all the time by the body A through the arm. Okay, so C is the part which is entangled with matter and is to experience matter. But this C should be guided by A through the B, which is arm. So means our body, our brain should be able to direct the hand what to do. Under favorable circumstances, additional strength and even additional matter may be poured from the body through the arm into the hand, so that the control may become more and more perfect. So sometimes through certain practices also, which we will discuss later, more energy will be poured from the body to the hand so that the hand can gain more control. The hand may grow in size as well as in strength, and the more it does so, the better. So long as the communication through the arm is kept open freely and the body retains control. So basically, the idea is C, which is the hand, will experience the world and gains more experience, becomes stronger and grow in size. This is good as long as C remains in contact with A. So it means as long as hand is remained in what you call connection with the body. So the body can control the hand. For the very entanglement of the causal matter which constitutes the hand awakens it to a keen activity and an accuracy of response to fine shades of vibration, which it could gain in no other way. And this, when transmitted through the arm to the body, means the development of the ego himself. So means this A will experience different vibrations, learn lessons, and then transmit it to A. And this means the ego is learning through the incarnated soul. The higher soul is learning through the incarnated soul. Unfortunately, the course of events does not always follow the ideal plan of working indicated above. So this is the plan, but unfortunately, it doesn't go well all the time. It's like investment in business also. So the expectation is we put some money, we invest, and then we get the investment back plus profit. But sometimes things happen. So sometimes loss happens. So when the control of the body, which is A, is feeble, it sometimes happens that the hand becomes so thoroughly enmeshed in lower matter that as said, it actually identifies itself with that lower matter, forgets for the time its highest estate, and thinks of itself as the whole ego. If the matter be of the lower mental plane, then we shall have a man who is wholly materialistic. He may perhaps be keenly intellectual, but not spiritual. He may very likely be intolerant of spirituality and quite unable to comprehend or appreciate it. He may probably call himself practical, material of fact, unsentimental, while in reality he is as hard as the nether millstone. And because of that hardness, his life, from the point of view of the ego, is a failure and he's making no spiritual progress. Now, the problem is sometimes this hand forgets about the body. The hands or part C thinks he is the whole, he is the ego. Now, this can happen in different levels. One level is mental plane. So some people, have you seen there are some people who are very mental, maybe even like scientific based, but materialistic. They don't believe in spirituality. So they only believe in science, and the science which is very material. Whatever is connected with spiritual, they don't believe. They are skeptic. They think it's like rubbish. So this is a kind of that. And this example is that kind of people. They are the matter that they are entangled with is a mental matter, lower mental plane, and therefore they are wholly materialistic. They don't believe in spirituality. So although they think they are actually practical, but from the point of view of the ego, this is failure because there is no spiritual progress. Now, if on the other hand, the matter in which he is so fatally entangled be astral, he will on the physical plane be one who thinks only of his own gratification, who is utterly ruthless when in pursuit of some object which he strongly desires, a man quite unprincipled and of brutal selfishness. Such a man lives in his passions, just as the man enmeshed in mental matter lives in his mind. Cases such as these have been spoken of as lost souls, though they are not irretrievably lost. Madame Blavatsky says of such men, there is, however, still hope for a person who has lost his higher soul through his vices while he is yet in the body. He may still be redeemed and made to turn on his material nature, for either an intense feeling of repentance or one single earnest appeal to the ego that has fled, or best of all, an active effort to amend one's ways may bring the higher ego back again. The thread of connection is not altogether broken. Okay, so the second group is the group that is entangled into astral matter. So you may have seen these people when they have a certain desire for something, they do whatever it takes to get it. So they may hurt others, they may injure others because of their selfish desires. Because when they have a certain desire, they have to satisfy the desire no matter how. Okay, so this person is called lost soul. But based on theosophy, based on Madame Blavatsky, they are not yet hopeless because at some point, if they regret this and if they have this intense feeling of repentance or they really ask forgiveness from the ego or they do something to an active effort to amend their ways, this connection may, the spiritual cord may connect again. So the thread of connection is not altogether broken. Question: we can lose the higher soul, but the connectivity can come back with repentance. Yes, as long as we are still alive. Here it says, still hope for a person who has lost his higher soul through his vices while he is yet in the body. So even if the person has led a very terrible life, but at some point they realize what they did was wrong, so they feel repentance and then they do something to amend what they have done, the connection will get connected again and they will be saved. Of course, the karma is there, so they have to harvest the result of what they have sown. Let's say they have hurt so many people already, but just feeling repentance, all the karma will not disappear. They still have to go through the karma, but at least the higher soul will not be bankrupted. It's like the higher soul will not have loss. It can be, they can connect back again, and there is hope, basically. Question, and if they don't have the body, they remain lost soul? We will talk about that here later. So there is a possibility of loss. In returning to our analogy of the investment, we note that in making his investment, the ego expects not only to recover the hand, which is C, but he expects also that it will be improved, both in quality and quantity. Its quality should be better because it should be much more awake and capable of instant and accurate response to a far more varied amount of vibrations than before. This capacity, the hand C, when reabsorbed, necessarily communicates to the body, though of course the store of energy which made such a powerful wave in the hand will be able to create a ripple when distributed throughout the whole substance of the body. We should remind ourselves here that although the vehicles can respond to and express evil thoughts and emotions, and altogether their excitement under such vibrations can produce perturbation in the entangled causal matter, yet it is quite impossible for C to reproduce those vibrations itself or to communicate them to the arm or to the body, simply because matter of the three higher mental levels can no more vibrate at the rate of the lower plane than the string of a volume tuned to a certain pitch can be made to produce a note lower than that pitch. So if you remember, we said the evil thoughts, negative emotions cannot reach the ego. So the ego either have benefit, like have profit or lessons or gap. So whenever the personality was producing negative thoughts and emotions, that appears for the ego as gap. So it means no learning, no improvement, no benefit. But when the personality was creating positive thoughts, positive emotions, helping others, things like that, then there is benefit for the ego. The hand C should also be increased in quantity because the causal body, like all other vehicles, is constantly changing its matter. And when special exercise is given to a certain part of it, that part grows in size and becomes stronger precisely as a physical muscle does when it is used. So just how when we use certain muscles in the body, the muscle grow in size and become bigger and stronger. The ego also gets bigger and stronger. Means when the ego put a portion of itself as the personality and the personality experience this world and learn lessons, that part of the ego becomes stronger and bigger. Okay, so that's what is called spiritual muscles. So whenever we are facing challenges, we are basically improving our spiritual muscles. Every earth life is an opportunity carefully calculated for such development in quality and quantity as is most needed by the ego. A failure to use that opportunity means the trouble and delay of another similar incarnation, and suffering probably aggravated by the additional karma incurred. So as we discussed, life is like school. So every school year we study things and then we take exams. If we fail, we have to redo the class again. So it means more time, delay, more effort, and in the case of life, suffering probably aggravated by additional karma. Against the increment which the ego has a right to expect from each incarnation, we must offset a certain amount of loss, which in the earlier stages is scarcely avoidable. In order to be effective, the entanglement with lower matter must be very intimate, and it is found that When this is so, it is scarcely ever possible to recover every particle, especially from the connection with the astral body. So, although there are profit, but there is usually loss also, especially in the earlier incarnations, because in the earlier incarnation, the ego is like entangling more and more into matter to actually learn the vibration and how to work with them and how to express itself through them. So therefore, when after death, the energy is going back to the higher soul, some portion of the matter will be lost because it's so entangled with physical, astral, lower mental matter, especially astral, that cannot be taken out fully. When the time comes for separation from the astral body, it is almost always a shade, not a mere shell, that is left behind on the astral plane. And that very distinction means that some of the causal material is lost. So that is, especially in earlier stages of evolution, unavoidable. Except in the case of an unusually bad life, however, this amount should be much smaller than that gained by growth, so that there should be on the whole a profit on the transaction. So usually what the higher soul gets back is much more than what is lost. So usually there is a profit at the end of the day, but sometimes, so this is a normal case, there is some lost, but what is gained is much more. But sometimes in abnormal cases, the loss is more. Now we will also discuss some other abnormal cases that the whole thing may be lost. We will talk about it shortly. The student should not allow the analogy of the arm and the hand to mislead him into thinking of the arm and the hand as permanent appanages of the ego. Okay, so during a life period, they may certainly be considered as separate, but at the end of each life period, they withdraw into the body, and the result of the experience is distributed, as it were, through the whole mass of its substance. When therefore the time comes for the ego again to put part of himself into incarnation, he does not nor can he stretch out again the old arm and the old hand, for they have become absorbed in him and become part of him, just as a cup full of water emptied into a bucket becomes part of the water in the bucket and cannot be separated from it. So we should not think of the hand and the arm is like in every incarnation, same arm and same hand will be used. It's only for our understanding that this analogy is used. But a better analogy to understand this matter is if we have a cup of water, so in every incarnation, we pour from a bucket of water into a cup of water. The cup of water will experience certain things and get colored. And then at the end of the incarnation, the cup of water will be thrown back into the bucket. So the next incarnation, another cup is used. Let's say a mug is used. So the shape is different from the previous one. And when we take again from the bucket, it's not the same water as before because the previous water is already diluted inside the whole bucket. So that's why this, for example, me, Hengame, as I am right now, can never happen in the future anymore because when my consciousness goes back to my higher soul, it gets diluted with the whole energy of the higher soul. And when in the next incarnation come back, it will never be the same me as it is me in this incarnation. Any coloring matter symbolizing the qualities developed by experience which was present in the cup is distributed through the paler tint through the whole bucket full of water. There's no more Hengame 2 or 3 or 2.1. There will be totally another incarnated soul. So the plan is therefore exactly parallel to that we have already studied in the case of group souls, except that a group soul may put down many tentacles simultaneously while the ego put forth only one at a time. Okay, so similarly, this is just what we discussed. We discussed right now and we discussed it during the group souls chapter. Okay, the difference is for humans, there is only one higher soul and one incarnated soul. But for animal group souls, there is one higher soul and several incarnated animals. In each incarnation, therefore, the personality is obviously quite a different one from those preceding it, though, of course, the ego behind it remains the same. In the case of men, such as those described above, men living entirely in their passions or their minds, there would be no gain, either in quality or quantity, since the vibrations would not be such as could be stored in the causal body. And on the other hand, as the entanglement has been so strong, there would certainly be considerable loss when the separation took place. Okay, so we just discussed that lower vibrations cannot reach to the ego, so there is gap. So it means there is nothing received by the higher soul. Now, and we discussed usually there is some loss because of the entanglement of the causal matter into the lower planes. So sometimes this is like balance, so means the ego doesn't receive anything but receives a bit but loses a bit. So at the end it's like zero. But sometimes don't receive anything and lose something. So at the end of the day there is loss. In cases where the hand C has asserted itself against the arm and pressed it back towards the body, the arm has become attenuated and almost paralyzed, its strength and substance being withdrawn into the body, while the hand has set up for itself and makes on its own account jerky and spasmodic movements which are not controlled by the brain. If the separation could become perfect, it would correspond to an amputation at the wrist, but this very rarely takes place during physical existence, although only so much. Communication remains as is necessary to keep the personality alive. Sometimes if the person is really living a terrible life, the personality may push away the arm, okay, which is the connection between the hand and the body. And then the hand will do its own work, like even you have seen our physical body has some movement which is not controlled by the brain, and it's like spasmodic movements or jerk movements. Okay, so but it's still connected, but the arm is like paralyzed. But if separation is complete, it's like the hand is amputated, which is rare to happen when the person is still alive, but in some cases happens also. Such a case is not hopeless, for even at the last moment, fresh life may be poured through the paralyzed arm, if a sufficiently strong effort be made, and thus the ego may be enabled to recover some proportion of the hand, just as he has already recovered most of the arm. So means if it's not amputated, if it's just numb, the connection is still there, there is still hope. At some point, it's possible that the ego pours some energy and then recovers some portion of the hand. Nevertheless, such a life has been wasted, for even if the man just contrived to escape serious loss, at any rate nothing has been gained, and much time has been frittered away. So even if the ego takes the hand, portion of the hand back, because some portion is lost, some portion is back, it's like no progress. Now look at this, we are going to discuss this. Amputation, this is amputation at the shoulder. And this is extreme case. The whole body is lost. So what we just discussed is not so much of gain, but not so much of loss. It's like even. But in these two cases, it's even worse. The most disastrous catastrophe which can occur to an ego is that in which the personality captures the part of the ego which is put down and actually causes it to break away. Now, previously we said the hand may push the arm back. So it's like amputated from the hand, but at least the arm is retrieved back to the body. Now, in this case, the hand will pull the arm and causes it to break from the arm. It's like amputation at the shoulder. Such cases are exceedingly rare, but they have happened. This time the hand, instead of repelling the arm and driving it gradually back into the body, by degrees absorbs the arm and detaches it from the body. Now this diagram illustrates such a case. This could be accomplished only by determined persistence in deliberate evil. In short, by black magic. So a black magician, by persistently doing evil acts, can basically pull the arm and cause it to break. So the loss is much more. Continuing the analogy, this is equivalent to amputation at the shoulder, or to the loss by the ego of nearly all his available capital. Fortunately for him, he cannot lose everything, because the arm and the hand together are only a small portion of the body, and behind A is the great undeveloped portion of the ego on the first and second mental subplane. So even if the hand takes the arm with it and there is a loss here, body is still there, and this portion which is undeveloped still there. So luckily, God has not allowed us, even the worst people on earth, to lose everything. Mercifully, a man, however incredibly foolish or wicked, cannot completely wreck himself, for he cannot bring that higher part of the causal body into activity until he has reached a level at which such evil is unthinkable. So God, knowing us, has put some safety measure in place that this portion can only be taken into activity when we are already in a great degree of evolution. So for a person who is very foolish or wicked, cannot completely destroy themselves. There are certain men who deliberately set themselves in opposition to nature, and instead of working for unity, towards which the whole force of the universe is pressing, they debase every faculty they possess for purely selfish ends. They spend their lives striving for separateness, and for a long time they attain it. It is said that the sensation of being utterly alone in space is the most awful fate that can ever befall a man. This extraordinary development of selfishness is, of course, the characteristic of the black magician, and it is among their ranks only that men can be found who are in danger of this terrible fate. Many and loathsome as are their varieties, they may all be classed in one or other of two great divisions. Both classes use such occult arts as they possess for selfish purposes, but these purposes differ. In the commoner and less formidable type, the object pursued is the gratification of sensual desire of some sort. Naturally, the result of such a life is to center the man's energy in his astral body. Having succeeded in killing out from himself every unselfish or affectionate feeling, every spark of higher impulse, nothing is left but a remorseless, ruthless monster of lust, who finds himself after death neither able nor desiring to rise above the lower subdivisions of the astral plane. The whole of such mind as he has is absolutely in the grip of desire, and when the struggle takes place, the ego can recover none of it, and in consequence find himself seriously weakened. Question at a level is unthinkable. Kindly explain where it was. Where did we talk about it? We say such evil is unthinkable. So I cannot explain. There are some black magicians. I think in the study book of the solar system, we discussed about Atlanteans and the black magicians there. They caused the whole civilization um, to sink. So, so many black magicians use um, their practices for, yes, unthinkable means beyond imagination. It's difficult to even explain. It's like very, very serious, something like that. Okay, so this is still talking about this. So means through act of black magician, they have killed whatever vibration which is connected with higher emotions and affection, and therefore after they die, there is no way they can rise above. So therefore, the hand and the arm is lost. For the time being, he has cut himself off from the current of evolution, and so until he can return to incarnation, he stands, or so it seems to him, outside that evolution, in the condition of Avicii or the waveless. Even when he does return to incarnation, it cannot be among those who he has known before, for he has not enough available capital left to provide ensoulment for a mind and body at his previous level. He must now be content, therefore, to occupy vehicles of a far less evolved type, belonging to some earlier race. He has thus thrown himself far back in evolution and must climb over again many rungs of the ladder. So means this group has lost the investment, has lost the capital. So they have to wait. Sometimes they cannot immediately incarnate among their group because they have lost the capital. Now they have nothing much basically. So they have to wait, or they have to incarnate in races or communities much, much less than what they were before, like like as savages in some tribes or something like that, because they have lost their capital. I think in the study book of solar system, we also discussed about the group who had lots of pride and they refused to incarnate, and at some later stage they had to incarnate in much less bodies. So something similar happened to this group. They actually have thrown themselves much far back in evolution, and they have to climb it again slowly. So he will probably be born as a savage, but will most likely be a chief among them, as he will still have some intellect. It has been said that he may even throw himself so far back that he may be unable to find in the world, in its present condition, any type of human body low enough for the manifestation which he now requires, so that he may be incapacitated from taking any further part in the scheme of evolution, and may therefore have to wait in a kind of condition of suspended animation for the commencement of another. Meanwhile, the amputed personality, having broken the silver thread that binds it to the master, is of course no longer a permanent evolving entity, but remains full of vigorous and wholly evil life, entirely without remorse or responsibility. Now, that portion which was cut cannot connect back because there is no silver thread. So remains as an evil entity. We will discuss what happens to it shortly. Eventually disintegrates. As it is destined to disintegrate amidst the unpleasant surroundings of the eighth sphere, it tries to maintain some sort of existence on the physical plane as long as possible. We will talk about eighth sphere in the next slide. Okay, so it is disconnected, but it wants to continue its life in the physical plane. The sole means of prolonging its baneful existence is vampirism of some sort. When that fails, it has been known to seize upon any available body, driving out the lawful owner. The body chosen might very probably be that of a child, both because it might be expected to last longer and because an ego which had not yet really taken hold could be more easily dispossessed. In spite of its frenzied efforts, its power seems soon to fail, and it is said there is no instance on record of it successfully stealing a second body after its first theft is worn out. This also happens very rare because usually the incarnated soul has control over the bodies, but sometimes a body of a child is chosen because there is less control and also lasts longer. But after one time, the body is stolen. It cannot happen for the second time. Means there were no cases which was observed that the second time another body was stolen. The creature is a demon of the most terrible type, a monster for whom there is no permanent place in the scheme of evolution to which we belong. Its natural tendency, therefore, is to drift out of this evolution and to be drawn into that astral cesspool known as the eighth sphere, because what passes into it stands outside the ring of our seven worlds or globes and cannot return into their evolution. So this is like a trash landfill. So whatever which is cannot continue, the evolution in the seventh globe will be thrown into the eighth sphere. There, surrounded by loathsome relics of all the concentrated vileness of the ages that are past, burning ever with desire, yet without the possibility of satisfaction. This monstrosity slowly decays, its mental and causal matter being thus at last set free. Such matter will never rejoin the ego from which it has torn itself, but will be distributed amongst the other matter of the plane, to enter gradually into fresh combinations and so be put to better uses. Such entities are, as already stated, exceedingly rare, and moreover they have power to seize only those who have in their nature pronounced defects of the kindred type. So that portion will go to the eighth sphere, remains there to disintegrate, and it's like recycled. The portion of the causal matter will not go back to the same ego, but is used um, for a better use. It's like goes back to the plane, the causal plane, and enter gradually into fresh combinations and be put into better use. It's like recycled. The other type of black magician, in outward appearance more respectable, is yet really even more dangerous because more powerful. This is the man who, instead of giving himself up altogether to sensuality, sets before himself the goal of a more refined but not less unscrupulous selfishness. His object is the acquisition of occult power higher and wider, but still to be used always for his own gratification and advancement, to further his own ambition or satisfy his own revenge. This black magician is even more powerful and not only using the astral matter, but also very advanced mentally. But still, the use is only selfish. In order to gain this, he adopts the most rigid asceticism as regards mere fleshly desires and stars out the grosser particles of his astral body as perseveringly as does the pupil of the Great White Brotherhood. So these black magicians are also quite developed and powerful. But though it is only a less material kind of desire, with which he will allow his mind to become entangled, the center of his energy is nonetheless entirely in his personality. So just how the students of Great White Brotherhood do practice white magic and try to evolve, this group also practice diligently but black magic. When therefore the separation at the end of the astral life takes place, the ego is unable to recover any of his investment. For this man, the result is therefore much the same as the former case, except that he will remain in touch with the personality much longer, and will to some extent share its experiences so far as it is possible for an ego to share them. The fate of that personality, however, is very different. The comparatively tedious astral integument is not strong enough to hold it for any length of time on the astral plane, and yet it has entirely lost touch with the heaven world, which should have been its habitat. For the whole effort of the man's life has been to kill out such thoughts as naturally find the results at that level. His one endeavor has been to oppose natural evolution, to separate himself from the great whole, and to war against it. And as far as the personality is concerned, he has succeeded. It is cut off from the light and life of the solar system. All that is left to it is the sense of absolute isolation, of being alone in the universe. Thus, in this rare case, the lost personality practically shares the fate of the ego from which it is in process of detaching itself. But in the case of the ego, such an experience is only temporary, although it may last for what we would call a very long time, and the end of it will be reincarnation and a fresh opportunity. For the personality, however, the end is disintegration, the invariable end, of course, of that which has cut itself off from its source. In a case of this kind involving the loss of an entire personality, the ego does no evil intentionally. He has let the personality get out of hand, and for that he is responsible. He is therefore responsible for weakness rather than for direct evil. Whilst the ego has fallen back terribly, yet he does go on, probably not immediately because he seems to be stunned at first. This is the second group, which has lost the whole body, the whole personality. The portion which is left still continues evolution, not immediately because it's like shocked, but after a long time. And again, we will discuss later, they have to wait until they find a body in their own level. So they may have to wait until they find a much lower um, body to incarnate in. And this personality, this whole body which is lost, will be disintegrated eventually because it's cut off from the source. After such an experience, an ego would always be peculiar. Now, as discussed here, the ego is not evil for this to happen, but the ego was weak, so the ego could not control the personality. Now, he would be dissatisfied and would have recollections of something higher and greater than now he could reach. It is a pure, fearful condition, but still the ego has to take the karma of it and realize that he has brought it upon himself. It is reported that there is another, even more remote possibility, just as the hand, C, may absorb the arm and revolt against the body, A, setting up on its own account and breaking away altogether. It is, or at any rate has been in the past, just possible that the disease of separateness and selfishness may infect the body also. This is what we just discussed. So the whole body will cut off from the causal body. Even if it is then absorbed into the monstrous growth of evil and may be torn away from the undeveloped portion of the ego, so that the causal body itself may be hardened and carried away instead of only the personality. This class of case would correspond not to an amputation but an entire destruction of the body. Such an ego could not incarnate in the human race. Ego, though it be, it would fall into the depths of animal life and would need at least a whole chain period to regain the status which it had lost. This, though theoretically possible, is practically scarcely conceivable. It will be noted, however, that even in this case, the undeveloped part of the ego remains as the vehicle of the monad. Whilst some scriptures, oops, I think something wrong with my PowerPoint. Being so terrible that the PowerPoint also hangs. Server B. Okay. Yes, PowerPoint reincarnated. So such an ego could not reincarnate. Okay, so this, though theoretically possible, is practically scarcely conceivable. It will be noted, however, that even in this case, the undeveloped part of the ego remains as the vehicle of the monad. While some ancient scriptures speak of men sinking back into the animal kingdom, there is no direct evidence of any such cases. Okay, sometimes you may have heard in your culture or religion, they talk about a person who is living really terrible life, incarnate as an animal later on. This theoretically possible in this case of the whole body taken with the hand and the arm, but it's not practically possible because now the higher soul has one incarnated soul, but in the case of animal, one higher soul has several incarnated souls. So there are other cases in which man may come into touch with animal consciousness and suffer terribly through it. This was explained in the Astral Body book, that the soul, because cannot take another person's body, may take animal's body and get chained or prisoned inside the animal body. That is possible. But to reincarnate as an animal is not possible now. Whatever may have been possible in distant past. Maybe in distant past it was possible, but based on the book now, it's not possible. Based on the book, it's not possible at this point of time, but may be possible in distant past. Sometimes these egos need to wait for a long time until they find a certain body which is aligned with their um, degree of evolution. We may here make a slight digression in order to explain how it is that even in cases such as those described above, a really serious loss is no easy matter. Owing to the fact that good thoughts and emotions work in the higher types of matter, and that finer matter is far more easily moved than coarser matter, it follows that a given amount of force spent in good thought or feeling produces perhaps 100 times as much effect as precisely the same amount of force sent out into coarser matter. If this were not so, it is obvious that the ordinary man would make no progress at all. If a man throws a certain amount of energy into some evil quality, it has to express itself through the lower and heavier astral matter. And whilst any kind of astral matter is exceedingly subtle as compared with anything on the physical plane, yet as compared with higher matter of its own plane, it is just gross as lead is on the physical plane when compared with the finer matter. Okay, now we are very lucky that the effect of good thoughts are like 100 times more than the bad thoughts. So it means if a person is even evil but creates some good thoughts, they still progress. For us to really move backward, the person should be super evil, not generating any good thoughts at all. Question, meaning even the worst has to wait for its incarnation in a human body. Just as we discussed, that portion of the um, ego which was in the second and first subplane will not be lost. But they have to wait for a long time because the capital is lost. So they have to wait for a long time for earlier stages of evolution so they can incarnate again. If therefore a man should exert exactly the same amount of force in the direction of good, it would have to move through much finer matter of the higher subplanes and would produce, as said, at least 100 times as much effect. Or if we compare the lowest with the highest, probably more than 1,000 times as much. Whilst we are probably entitled to assume that 90% of the thought and feeling of the undeveloped man is self-centered, even if not actually selfish, yet if 10% of it is spiritual and unselfish, the man must already be rising somewhat above the average. Think about it. It says if a person only produced 10% good spiritual unselfish thoughts, the person should be rising above the average. In fact, if these proportions did produce commensurate results, the vast majority of humanity would take 9 steps backward for everyone forward. And we should have retrogression so rapid that a few incarnations would deposit us in the animal kingdom out of which we evolved. So if one good thought would equal one bad thought, the same amount of effect, one incarnation would take us like 6 or 7 incarnations backward. So we are so lucky that good thoughts, unselfish thoughts are creating 100 or even 1,000 times more effect than bad thoughts. Sajid is saying bad thoughts are coarse and dense, hence can't spread so a blessing. Yes, good thoughts, unselfish thoughts can effect much more, produce a much more widespread effect and long-lasting compared to bad thoughts. Happily for us, however, the effect of 10% of force directed to good ends enormously outweighs that of the 90% devoted to selfish purposes. And so, on the whole, such a man makes an appreciable advance from life to life. So means it says if a person only generates 10% good unselfish thoughts, they will create an appreciable advancement in their life from life to life. A man who can show even 1% of good makes a slight advance. So it will be readily understood that a man whose account balances exactly so that there is neither advance nor retrogression must have been living a distinctly evil life. While to obtain an actual descent in evolution, a person must be an unusually consistent villain. Okay, so it means if a person is super evil, still is like no improvement, but no retrogression also. So for a person to go backward, they have to be a consistent villain. Amazing. Apart from these considerations, we have to bear in mind that the Logos himself is by his resistless power steadily pressing the whole system onwards and upwards, and that however slow this cyclic progression may seem to us, it is a fact which cannot be neglected. For its effect is that a man who accurately balances his good and evil comes back not to the same actual position, but to the same relative position, and therefore even he has made some slight advance, and is, as it were, in a position just a little better than that which he has actually deserved and made for himself. So it says, even Logos himself means life or universe is also evolving in a cyclic upward manner. So even if a person has balanced of evil and good deeds, so it means there is no progression based on his or her own deeds, because the universe is moving upward, still when he or she comes back, there is some small advancements. We are so blessed. So it means if a man is having no progress, still is progressing to a very little degree. It is thus clear that if anyone is so foolish as to want to go really backwards against the stream, he will have to work hard and definitely towards evil. So it says if someone wants to really go towards evil, have to work hard towards evil. Because if you don't work hard, you still progress. There is no fear of sliding back. That is one of the old delusions which remains from the times of the belief in the Orthodox devil who was so much stronger than the deity that everything in the world was working in his favor. So it's not like that. The fact is that the exact opposite is the case, and everything round a man is calculated to assist him, if only he understands it. There is a wrong belief that they think evil is stronger. No, everything around human is made to assist him. And if any human being wants to go backward, they have to work hard towards evil. And if they don't work hard, they just let it be. They don't even do anything to improve themselves. They still move forward, but very, very slowly. Amazing. Yeah, we are so blessed. Now let's study chapter 26, the ego and the personality. It is now necessary to study more deeply the relationship between the ego and the personality, this time from the point of view of the ego. We already discussed about the ego and the personality from the point of view of the personality. Now we want to study it from the point of view of the ego. Let us recapitulate the main facts regarding the constitution of man as monad, ego, and personality. The fragment of the divine life, which we know as the monad, manifests itself upon the plane of Atma as the triple spirit. Of these three aspects, one, the spirit itself, remains upon its own plane, that of Atma. The second, that of intuition or pure reason, as it is sometimes called, puts itself down one stage and expresses itself through the matter of the plane of Buddhi. The third aspect, that of intelligence, puts itself down two planes and expresses itself through the matter of the higher mental plane. We discussed about this already, talking about the Atma Buddhi Manas, the higher triangle. It is now necessary to study more deeply the relationship between the ego and the personality, this time from the point of view of the ego. Okay, we discuss this. This expression of the monad on the planes of Atma, Buddhi, and Manas is the ego or individuality. The ego expresses itself on the lower planes as a personality, which is also triple in its manifestation and is moreover an accurate reflection of the arrangement of the ego. But like other reflections, it reverses itself. Intelligence or higher manas reflects itself in lower manas. Pure reason or buddhi reflects itself in the astral body, and in some way much more difficult to comprehend, the spirit of Atma reflects itself upon the physical plane. There is always a link or line of communication between the higher self or ego and the lower self or personality. This link is known as antakarna, or we call it spiritual cord. The antakarna may be regarded as the arm stretched out between the little piece of the ego that is awakened and the part put down the hand. So we discussed about this already. Antakarna is like the arm stretched out to the incarnated soul. When the two are perfectly joined, when the ego and the personality are perfectly in tune and united, then the attunement thread of antakarna ceases to exist. Its destruction implies that the ego no longer needs an instrument, but works directly on the personality. When one will operate the ego and the personality, then there is no longer any need for antakarna. So it means when we have yoga, when we have union between incarnated soul and higher soul, we don't need the antakarna anymore because they are one already. The term antakarna or internal agency is used also in another sense to denote the whole of the triple higher self or ego, because this is the channel or bridge between the monad and the lower self. Now, on another level, the higher soul is also a bridge between the lower self and the monad. So therefore, antakarna is also sometimes called to the higher soul because it's a bridge between the monad and the lower self. In its earlier stages, man's evolution consists in the opening of this antakarna or line of communication, so that the ego may be increasingly able to assert himself through it, and finally entirely to dominate the personality, so that it may have no separate thought or will, but may be merely as it should be an expression of the ego on the lower planes, so far, of course, as the limitation of the lower planes permit. The link that binds the lower to the higher self is often spoken of as a thread of silver, as befits an emblem of purity. And in Achieving Oneness with the Higher Soul, Grandmaster explained that also as the silver cord. The heart is the center in the body for the higher triad, Atma, Buddhi, Manas, so that when the consciousness is centered in the heart during meditation, it is most susceptible to the influence of the higher self or ego. The heart is the center in the body for the higher triad. Okay, we just read it. The head is the seat of the psycho-intellectual man. It has its various functions in 7 cavities, including the pituitary body and the pineal gland. He who, in concentration, can take his consciousness from the brain to the heart should be able to unite Kama Manas to the higher Manas through the lower Manas, which, when pure and free from Kama, is the Antakarna. He will then be in the position to catch some of the promptings of the higher triad. The man who is absolutely untrained has practically no communication with the ego. The initiate, on the other hand, has full communication. Consequently, we find, as is to be expected, that there are men at all stages between the two extremes. Now, you see, does it appear a bit familiar when in Twin Hearts meditation, Grandmaster says the secret is in your heart. So we focus on the heart and the crown. So basically we are trying to use the heart and then raise the consciousness higher and connect with this higher triad through the heart. Lower manas is one with higher manas, in the same way that the ray is one with the sun. The tiny fragment of the ego which is put down into the personality is the point of consciousness which clairvoyance can see moving about the man. So the tiny fragment of the ego which is put down into the personality is the point of consciousness which clairvoyance can see moving about the man. This also explained in the Achieving Oneness with the Higher Soul. According to one system of symbology, it is seen as the golden man, the size of a thumb, who dwells in the heart. Others, however, see it rather in the form of a star, a brilliant star of light. A man may keep his star of consciousness where he will. That is to say, in any one of the 7 principal chakras or centers of the body. Which of these is most natural to a man depends largely upon his type or ray, and probably also upon his race and sub-race. So this tiny fragment of the ego, the consciousness, which is put down in personality, clairvoyance can see it, and symbolically it is shown as a golden man in the size of a thumb, which dwells in the heart, or sometimes as a brilliant star of light. There is an image in the Achieving Oneness book. Men of the 5th root race nearly always keep this consciousness in the brain, in the center dependent upon the pituitary body. There are, however, men of other races to whom it comes more natural to keep it habitually in the heart, the throat or solar plexus. The star of consciousness is thus the representative of the ego in the lower planes, and as it manifests through the lower vehicles, we call it the personality, the man as he is known to his friends down here. Now, why men of 5th root race nearly keep it in this consciousness in the brain? If you remember, we said the 5th root race is focused on developing the intelligence. Furthermore, whilst in the case of the ordinary man, the consciousness of the ego on his own plane is only partial and vague, yet so far as it is active, it is always on the side of good, because it desires that which is favorable to its own evolution as a soul. In fact, the never-changing desire of the ego is for progress, for the unfoldment of the higher self, and for bringing of the lower vehicles into tune as its instruments. Any of those thoughts that we call evil are for the ego impossible, for in the ego, so far as any quality is developed, it is pure. If, for example, affection is there, it is utterly untrained by jealousy, envy, or selfishness. It is a mirror of the divine love, in so far as the ego can reproduce it at his level. So, as Grandmaster also says, higher soul is pure but not perfect. So, it cannot think negative thoughts, but it's not perfect also. Furthermore, the ego is never likely to be wrong. He is apparently not deceived about anything, but that he is ignorant of certain matters is quite clear, for indeed, the very purpose of incarnation is to remove that ignorance. So it means the ego is never wrong. So it doesn't make mistake, but sometimes it's ignorant. So it doesn't say something, or it doesn't think something wrong, but sometimes through ignorance doesn't know. So the whole purpose of incarnation is to remove this ignorance. But as we have seen, the fragment of the ego which has been put down into lower matter becomes so keenly and vividly conscious in that matter that it thinks and acts as though it were a separate being. It forgets that it belongs to the less developed but far wider consciousness of the ego and sets up in the business of life on its own account and tries to go as it wants rather than as the ego wishes. So we discussed about this. That portion of the ego which comes down and entangles with matter becomes much more vivid and active, so therefore may forgets about the ego and thinks he is the ego itself. So thinks about his own wants rather than the ego's wishes. Furthermore, the ego, with all his mighty powers, is very much less accurate than the lower mind, and the personality, valuing above all the discriminating powers of the lower mind, which it is intended to develop, often comes in consequence to despise the far higher but vaguer self, and acquires a habit of thinking of itself as an independent ego. Okay, this is the same thing we just said. We may note here that all through the course of our evolution, there is always a danger that a man should identify himself with that point at which, or that vehicle in which he is most fully conscious. So, because that portion of the ego which is entangled is more conscious and more vivid, may identify itself with the personality rather than the ego. Hence, as we have seen, sometimes it seems as though the fragment worked against the whole, but the man who is instructed declines to be deluded and reaches back through the keen alert consciousness of the fragment to the true consciousness behind, which is as yet so little developed. Okay, so it means if a person is aware, tries to go beyond that and think about the ego, connects with the ego. We have already seen that in the nature of things, there can be no evil in the causal body or in the ego. But wherever there is a gap in the causal body, there is a possibility that the lower vehicles may run into some sort of evil action. We discussed about this in previous chapters. Thus, for example, the astral elemental may take possession of the man and rush him into the commission of a crime. In such a case, the ego is not sufficiently awake to step in and prevent the action, or perhaps he does not understand that the passion or greed of the astral body may force the lower self into commission of the crime. Evil therefore does not come from the higher self. It comes from a lack in the higher self. Because if the ego were more developed, he would check the man on the brink of the evil thought, and the crime would not be committed. Do you remember previously, or in some cartoons, we have this person, let's say this is a person, and then there is this angel on one side and evil on another side. Okay, so let's say this evil is the astral elemental trying to make the person commit a mistake. Now, if that portion, that lesson is already learned by the ego, and there is no, here it says, you see, there is a gap. If there is no gap, means the angel is available there, immediately will rectify that thought and doesn't allow the person to commit a mistake. But let's say if that lesson is not yet learned and there is a gap in the causal body, then there is no angel. It's like as though there is no angel to guide the person. So the person may commit a mistake. So that's why we discussed in earlier chapters that one way to be immune from evil is to develop that portion, that lesson, that virtue. In ordinary men, the ego has not much grasp of the personality, nor a clear conception of its purpose in sending it forth. And as we have seen, the small piece which meets us in the personality grows to have ways and opinions of its own. It is developing by the experience it gains, and it is passed on to the ego. But together with this real development, it usually gathers a good deal which is hardly worthy of that name. It acquires knowledge but also prejudices which are not really knowledge at all. It does not become quite free of those prejudices, be it noted of knowledge, of feeling, of action, until the man reaches adeptship. Gradually discovers these things to be prejudices and progress through them. But it has always a great deal of limitation from which the ego is entirely free. Okay, so I think in one of the books of Grandmaster, he says that as we are evolving, it's like eventually we realize that what we are attached to is just toys. And then, like a child who let go of the toys, we also let go of our prejudices, of knowledge, feeling, and action, and then we grow. In order to assist the ego in controlling his vehicles and to help to utilize them for his own purposes, a very great deal can be done by parents and teachers during infancy and childhood. We discussed about this also. For it makes a vast difference when the good rather than the evil germs in the child's bodies are aroused first. In the average man, there is a perpetual strain going on between the astral and mental bodies, and also neither of these bodies is in the least in tune with the ego or prepared to act as his vehicle. What is needed is the purification of the personality, and also the channel between it and the ego must be opened and widened. Until this is done, the personality sees everything and everybody from its own very limited point of view. The ego cannot see what is really going on. He perceives only the distorted picture of the personality, which is like a camera with a defective lens. What distorts the light rays and a faulty plate, which makes the result blurred, indistinct, and unequal. Okay, so what is really needed here is number one, purification, and number two, to increase the size of the spiritual cord so that there is more communication between the incarnated soul and the higher soul. Hence, in the case of most people, the ego cannot derive any satisfaction from the personality until it is in the heaven world. The ego himself knows the true from the false. He recognizes truth when he sees it and rejects the false. This you remember also we discussed about this, because the false creates a distorted image. But generally, when he casts an eye downwards into the personality, he finds so crazy a confusion of inconsequent thought forms that he can distinguish nothing definite. He turns away in despair and decides to wait for the quietude of the heaven world before attempting to pick up the fragments of truth out of this unseemly chaos. Under more peaceful conditions of devotion, as the emotion and thoughts of recent physical life come up one by one and envisage themselves in the vivid light of that world, they are examined with clear vision, the dross is thrown away, and the treasure is kept. Okay, so initially it's hard for the ego when the person is already alive to see through all these um, thoughts and cannot distinguish anything definite. It's like distorted view. So the ego has to wait for the personality to go back to it. So to actually examine and really gain something from the experience initially. The disciple should, of course, try to bring about that condition while still in the physical body purifying the personality and harmonizing it with the ego or soul. This is what we are trying to do. We are trying to unite with the higher soul through purification and spiritual practice so that while we are in the physical body, we can unite with the higher soul. Although the ego is undoubtedly only very partially expressed by his physical body, yet it would be inaccurate to speak of him as dissociated from that body. If we imagine the ego as a solid body and the physical plane as a surface, then if the solid is laid on the surface, obviously the plane figure representing the contact of the solid with the surface would be an exceedingly partial expression of the solid. This is what we discussed, like a surface which cuts through a cube shows an image of a square. Further, if the various sides of the solid were laid on the surface successively, we might obtain impressions which differed considerably from one another. All of them would be imperfect and partial because in all cases the solid would have an extension in an entirely different direction which could in no way be expressed in the flat surface. We discussed about this already. In the case of an ordinary man, we shall obtain a nearly accurate symbolism of the facts if we suppose the solid to be conscious, only so far as it is in contact with the surface. Nevertheless, the results gained through the expression of such consciousness would inhere in the solid considered as a whole and would be present in any later expression of it, even though that might differ considerably from previous expressions. So in every incarnation, the expression is different. When the ego is still undeveloped, it cannot respond to more than a very few of the extremely fine vibration of the higher mental plane, so that they pass through him practically without affecting him. At first, it needs powerful and comparatively coarse vibrations to affect him, as these do not exist in his own plane. He has to put himself down to lower levels in order to find them. Hence, full consciousness comes to him at first only in the lowest and densest of his vehicles, his attention being focused for a long time in the physical plane, so that although that plane is so much lower than his own, and offers so much less scope for activity, yet in those early stages he feels himself much more alive when he's working there because initially cannot really means the higher vibrations cannot really affect him. He cannot how to say understand them or gets them. So the only coarse vibrations of the physical plane he can communicate with. As his consciousness increases and widens its scope, he gradually begins to work more and more in matter one stage higher, in astral matter. At a much later stage, when he has attained to clear working in astral matter, he begins to be able also to express himself through the matter of his mental body. That is how gradually we evolve. Still later, The end of his present effort is achieved when he works as fully and clearly in the matter of the causal body on the higher mental plane as he does now on the physical plane. When an ego becomes sufficiently developed to come under the direct influence of a master, the amount of that influence which can be passed on to the personality depends upon the connection between that personality and the ego, which is very different in different cases. There is, in fact, an infinite variety in human life. As the spiritual force rests upon the ego, sometimes something of it must flow through to the personality always, because the lower is attached to the higher, just as the hand is attached to the body by the arm. But the personality can receive only what it can make itself able to receive. That's why there is a quote Grandmaster says, the light is always there. How much light comes to you depends on you. That means even if the master influence the ego, how much the personality gets depends also. Depends how much the personality can receive. There is also another important factor which comes into operation. The master always plays upon the qualities in the ego which are much obscured in the personality, so that in such a case, very little comes down to the personality. Just as only those experiences of the personality can be handed on to the ego which are compatible with the nature and interests of the ego, so only those impulses to which the personality can respond can express themselves in it. So means when a master is influencing the ego, only that portion which can express themselves through personality may reach to the personality. We must also bear in mind that whilst the ego tends to exclude the material and receive the spiritual, so the general tendency of the personality, at least in the earlier stages, is to exclude the spiritual and receive the material initially. And eventually, as the personality grows, can receive more of the spiritual kind also, but initially receives more of the material. A clairvoyant may sometimes see these influences at work. Thus, on a certain day, he may notice a characteristic of the personality much intensified, with no outward reason. The cause is often to be found in what is taking place at some higher level, the stimulation of that quality in the ego. A man may find himself, for example, overflowing with affection or devotion and quite unable on the physical plane to explain why. The cause is usually the stimulation of the ego, or on the other hand, it may be that the ego is taking some special interest in the personality for the time being. Sometimes you may notice ourselves or some people at some days suddenly feel lots of affection or devotion or some sort of higher thoughts or emotions that might be the influence. Maybe the master is giving some blessing to the ego, or maybe the ego is taking more interest over the personality. So there is a flow of energy. The relationship between a pupil and his master is not at all unlike that of the personality to the ego. Just as the ego may be considered to put down a small fragment of himself into the personality and express himself, however imperfectly, through that personality, so in the same sort of way, the pupil not merely represents the master, but is the master in a very real sense, but the master under tremendous limitations. Those limitations consist not only of the conditions of the lower planes themselves, but also, of course, of the personality of the pupil, which is by no means transcended. So it's like a bit similar to represent a master because of limitation of the planes. Meditation is a method of drawing the attention of the ego. It should, however, be borne in mind that in the practice of meditation, instead of trying to interrupt the ego and draw him down to the personality, we should strive to reach up to him in his higher activity. Okay, so we have been doing a lot of different types of meditations. The purpose is to raise the consciousness so that we can reach up to the ego. Higher influence is certainly invited by meditation, which is always effective, even though on the physical plane things may seem to be very dull and quite without zest. The feeling of dullness in the personality may in fact be due to the reaching upward of the ego and his consequent neglect to send energy down to the personality. So sometimes the ego may neglect the personality also to some extent. Meditation and the study of spiritual subjects in this earthly life undoubtedly make a very great difference in the life of the ego. For meditation opens the channel between the personality and the ego and keeps it open. Okay, so when we do meditation, we consciously doing the meditation opens the channel between the personality and the ego and keeps it open. It should, however, be borne in mind that the physical meditation is not directed for the ego, but for the training of the various vehicles to be channeled for the ego. Basically, the meditation is to train our vehicles to be able to raise the consciousness and to communicate with the ego and also to receive the impressions. In fact, during physical meditation, the ego regards the personality much as at any other time. He is usually slightly contemptuous. Nevertheless, the force which comes down is always that of the ego. But as it is only a small part, it tends to give a one-sided conception of things. The ordinary person who has not taken up spiritual matters seriously has a thread of connection between the personality and ego. In fact, this channel is often so narrow that sometimes it appears to be almost choked up. On some special occasion, as for example that of conversion, the force may break through again. For more developed persons, there is a constant flow in some measures between ego and personality. These considerations should bring home to us that it is by no means always accurate to judge the ego by his manifestation in the personality. Thus, for example, an ego of an intensely attractive type may make more show on the physical plane than another of far higher development, whose energy happens to be concentrated almost exclusively upon the causal or buddhic levels. Hence, people who judge merely by physical plane appearances are frequently entirely wrong in their estimation of the relative development of others. So, I mean, sometimes an ego might be so interested in the life of the personality and sometimes not. But when it's not, it doesn't mean that the person is less developed. Sometimes the ego may be focusing on much more higher development, not on the personality that much. Each of the successive descents of the ego into the lower planes is a limitation so indescribable that the man whom we meet down here on the physical plane is at best a fragment of the fragment, and as an expression of the real man is so inadequate as to furnish us with nothing even remotely resembling a conception of what that man will be at the end of his evolution. There are really three ways in which the ego may be developed and may influence the life. Number one, the way of the scientist and philosopher. These develop not only the lower mind but also the higher, so that a great deal of its more abstract and comprehensive kind of thought comes down into their consciousness. For such as these, the development of the buddhic consciousness will come later. Okay, so there are three ways to develop. One is like a scientist or philosopher. Second, the method of using the higher emotions, such as affection, devotion, or sympathy, and so awakening the Buddhic principle to a great extent without developing especially the intermediate causal body. Nevertheless, the causal body will be affected since all Buddhic development reacts very powerfully on the causal body. These people are not necessarily developing a Buddhic vehicle in which they can permanently live, but the use of the higher emotions unquestionably evoke uh, vibrations in the Buddhic matter. Thus, the man may receive a considerable amount of influence from the Buddhic plane before the vehicle is at all fully developed. And number three, the more obscure method in which the will is called into activity, the physical body in some way reacting on atomic matter. Very little is known as to how this operates through devotion and keen sympathy. A fairly advanced ego may sometimes be rather inconsiderate of his body because whatever is put down into the personality means so much taken from the ego, and he may therefore grudge such expenditure of force. An ego may be somewhat impatient and withdraw himself somewhat from the personality. In such case, however, there would always be a flow between the ego and personality, which is not possible with the ordinary man. So you see, it says you have three ways to develop. One is light or intelligence, one is higher emotions or love, and last one, will. As Grandmaster says, and the Trinity, light, love, power, or light, love, will, same three ways to develop. In the ordinary man, the fragment of the ego is as it were put down and left to fend for itself, though it is not completely cut off. At the more advanced stage mentioned, however, there is a constant communication between two along the channel. The ego can therefore withdraw himself whenever he chooses and leave a very poor representation of the real man behind. So we see that the relations between the lower and higher self very much in different people and at different stages of development. Okay? An ego busy with his own occupations on his own plane may forget for a time to pay his personality proper attention, just as even a good and thoughtful man may occasionally, under some special pressure of business, forget his horse or his dog. Sometimes when that happens, the personality reminds him of his existence by blundering into some foolishness which causes serious suffering. One may notice that sometimes after the completion of a special piece of work, that he has needed the cooperation of the ego to a large extent, as for example lecturing to a large audience. The ego takes away his energy and leaves the personality with only enough to feel rather dispirited. For a time, he admits that there was some importance in the work and therefore poured down a little more of himself. But afterwards, he leaves the unfortunate personality feeling rather depressed. So sometimes the ego may be so focused on his own occupations that forgets about the personality, like how a busy businessman may forget about his pets, like his dog or cat. So if this happens, the personality may do something foolish which draws back the ego's attention. Or sometimes when we do something for the benefit of humanity that needs ego's energy, then the ego may pour the energy down to us and then later leaves the personality uh, feeling rather depressed. We must ever recollect that the ego puts down into the personality only a very small part of himself. And as that part constantly becomes entangled in the interests which, because they are so partial, are often along lines different from the general activities of the ego himself. The ego does not pay any particular attention to the lower life of the personality unless something rather unusual happens to it. In the physical life of the ordinary man of the world, there is little of interest to the ego, and it is only now and then that something of real importance occurs that may for a moment attract his attention, so that from it he draws whatever is worth taking. The ordinary man lives in patches. More than half the time he is not awake to the real and higher life at all. If a man complains that his ego takes very little notice of him, let him ask himself how much notice he has taken of his ego. Of how often, for example, in any given day, he has he even thought of the ego? If he wishes to attract the attention of the ego, he must make the personality useful to him. As soon as he begins to devote the greater part of his thought to higher things, in other words, as soon as he really begins to live, the ego will be likely to take somewhat more notice of him. Okay, so most of the things that people do are not interesting and not helping the ego. So the ego will not notice and get bored with it. But when we do things that benefit the ego, then the ego will notice the personality more. I know it's after 9, but we have to at least finish this chapter. Quite long one. The ego is well aware that certain necessary parts of his evolution can be achieved only through his personality, in its mental, astral, and physical bodies. He knows therefore that he must sometime attend to it, must take it in hand, and bring it under his control. But we can well understand that the task may often seem uninviting, that a given personality may appear anything but attractive or hopeful. If we look at many of the personalities around us, their physical body full of drugs and poisons, their astral bodies reeking with greed and sensuality, and their mental bodies having no interests beyond money making and perhaps sport of the cruder varieties, it is not difficult to see why an ego surviving them and surveying them from his lofty height, might decide to postpone his serious effort to another incarnation in the hope that the next set of vehicles might be more amenable to influence than those upon which his horrified gaze now rests. We can imagine that he might say to himself, I can do nothing with that. I will take my chance of getting something better next time. It can hardly be worse. Meantime, I have much more important business to do up here. So it's like if the ego is hopeless and thinks this personality is not benefiting me at all, may think, okay, I will wait for the next incarnation so that I can get better vehicles to work with. And in this incarnation, let me just focus on what is more important for me. A similar state of affairs not infrequently happens in the early stages of a new incarnation. As we have already seen, from the birth of the child, the ego hovers over it and in some cases begins to try to influence its development while it is still very young. But as a general rule, he pays little attention to it until about the age of 7, by which time the work of the karmic elemental should be practically finished. But children differ so widely that it is not surprising to find that the relation between the egos and the personalities involved differ widely also. Okay, we discussed about this earlier. Some child personalities are quick and responsive, some are dull and wayward. When dullness and unresponsiveness are prominent, the ego often withdraws its active interest for the time, hoping that as the child body grows, it may become cleverer or more responsive. To us, such a decision may seem unwise because if the ego neglects its present personality, it's unlikely that the next will be an improvement upon it. And if he allows the child body to develop without his influence, the undesirable qualities which have been manifested may quite possibly grow stronger instead of dying out. But we are hardly in a position to judge since our knowledge of the problem is so imperfect and we can see nothing of the higher business to which the ego is devoting himself. From this, it will be seen how impossible it is to judge with any precision the position in evolution of anyone whom we see on the physical plane. In one case, karmic causes may have produced a very fair personality having an ego of only moderate advancement behind it. In another case, those causes may have given rise to an inferior or defective personality belonging to a comparatively advanced ego. That's why by just looking at the personality, at the physical body, we cannot judge the development of the ego, because karmic causes are also in play. Sometimes we may logically say, even if the personality is really not working, not doing something which benefit the ego should actually take interest in personality and guide it in the right direction. But he says we cannot judge because we don't know what the ego is doing in its own level. When the ego decides to turn the full force of his energy upon the personality, the change which he can produce is very great. No one who has not personally investigated the matter cannot imagine how wonderful, how rapid, how radical such a change may be when conditions are favorable. That is, when the ego is reasonably strong and the personality not incurably vicious, more especially when a determined effort is made by the personality on its side to become a perfect expression of the ego and make itself attractive to him. To understand how this can be, it is of course necessary to look at the matter simultaneously from 2 points of view. Most of us here are very emphatically personalities and think and act exclusively as such. Yet we know all the time that in reality we are egos. And those of us who by many years of meditation have rendered ourselves more sensitive to finer influences are often conscious of the intervention of the higher self. The more we can make a habit of identifying ourselves with the ego, the more clearly and sanely shall we view the problems of life. But so far as we feel ourselves to be personalities, it is obviously our duty and our interest to open ourselves to the ego, to reach up towards him, and persistently to set up within ourselves such vibrations as will be used to him. At least we should be sure that we do not stand in the way of the ego, that we always do our best for him according to our lights. Since selfishness is the intensification of the personality, the first step should be to rid ourselves of that vice. Next, the mind should be kept filled with high thoughts, for it is continually occupied with lower matters, even though those lower matters may be quite estimable in their way. The ego cannot readily use it as a channel of expression. So if we want to gain the interest of the ego, so number one, we have to do practices, purification, spiritual practice to raise our consciousness towards the ego and communicate with the ego and get its interest and do things that benefit the ego, create positive thoughts, higher thoughts, unselfish thoughts. So the first thing is to get rid of selfishness. When the ego makes a tentative effort, when he puts down, as we might say, an explanatory finger, he should be received with enthusiasm and his behests should be instantly obeyed, that he may more and more take possession of the mind and so come into his inheritance so far as the lower planes are concerned. So it means when the ego communicates with us, we have to accept it with enthusiasm, and if he gives us some direction or guidance or intuition, we have to follow so that the ego get more interested to do so. The personality should, so to speak, stand aside and let the ego, the barrier, fight in him. In so doing, however, the personality must take care that he is devoted to the work and not to his personal share or parts in it. He must take care that in a rush of personality he remembers all the time that it is the ego that is working in him. Although the vagueness of the ego, unless he were developed, may perhaps preclude him from indicating a particular line of work, yet when the personality, being more indefinite, has found the work, the ego can and does pour himself down into it, and enables him to do it in a much better manner and in an altogether grander frame of mind than the personality could attain unaided. From midway of chapter 26, and we will try to finish until chapter 35. in the next session. Thank you so much for joining us, and let's finish with a short invocation. Please close your eyes. Inhale and exhale slowly and deeply. Mentally say to the Supreme Being, Divine Father, Divine Mother, and all the great, great ones, thank you for all of your priceless blessings, for divine light, divine love, and divine power, divine guidance, help, and protection. Thank you for illuminating our minds. Thank you for making us understand the purpose in all this incarnation. Thank you in full faith. Inhale slowly, inhale all the blessings. Exhale slowly and be aware of your whole body. Inhale slowly, exhale slowly. Inhale slowly, inhale all the blessings. And when you are comfortable, gently open your eyes with a big, big smile. Atma Namaste. See you in 2 weeks' time. Bye.